everyone. My name is Cohen Schultz, and I'm a junior from West Lafayette, Indiana, pursuing 2 degrees in cybersecurity and global policy and East Asian languages and cultures on the Chinese track with a minor in German. Apart from this, I am also a Phi Beta Kappa inductee and undergraduate instructor within the Department of Informatics here at Indiana University. Additionally, I have the pleasure of serving as a Luddy Student Ambassador, facilitating events and information sessions for prospective students, and it is truly an honor to be speaking before you all today. As a cybersecurity and global policy student, I find myself consistently both questioning and studying the intersection of technical expertise with the policy that surrounds regulations and legal frameworks we see on the international stage. As I started my time here at HLS, I knew I wanted to combine this niche area of study with a foreign language critical to the US government. I decided upon Chinese and quickly joined the flagship program to accelerate my language learning. Last summer, I was given an incredible opportunity by the Chinese language flagship program to spend 8 weeks in Taiwan taking intensive language courses. I was able to attend classes at a university in Taipei and experience the culture in an extremely immersive fashion. My time overseas not only allowed me to increase my language proficiency, but also provided me with a profound understanding of the context in which many international issues in East Asia lie. After returning to the States, I had the chance to combine my skills and interests into a comprehensive research project through the United States Department of State's Diplomacy Lab project. Under the wonderful guidance of Interim Provost Dr. John Torchiari, my team and I worked to create a series of mathematical algorithms, software systems, and intelligence collection frameworks to quantify risk associated with various Chinese space technology companies. This risk was numerically classified into a structure we called the Space Score, allowing for quick analysis by State Department officials. As a result of our data collection, we had the pleasure of writing various policy memos, contextualizing our findings, and providing a deeper understanding for analysts overseeing our work. After nearly 21 weeks, we presented our results to the State Department's Office of Critical Technology Protection and Nonproliferation. Our findings provided the office with a fully functioning relational database and software tools that will continuously support further research within the field. This experience challenged me in ways I didn't know were possible, but is one of my most proud accomplishments to this day. This summer, I will be working as an intern at the United States Department of Defense, combining technical, language, and analytical skills into a comprehensive position that will challenge me just as my research did. I would like to once again thank Assistant Dean Isak Asare and Interim Provost Dr. John Torchiari for their guidance and support throughout my time here at HLS. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this afternoon's panel on space governance, Scott Shackelford, Associate Vice President and Vice Chancellor for Research at IU. Thank you.
Well done. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks for sticking with us. We're going to try to end on a high note, and that's one of many space puns that you can expect throughout the course of this panel. First, just thanks again to, of course, to David and Isak, to Heather, most importantly, and everybody else, particularly the students, for making this possible. As we all know, it takes a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes. Maybe not quite as much as an Artemis launch, but it's getting close at this point. This topic is well-timed. It's very convenient, and we're very thankful to NASA for accommodating this panel as part of their, re-entry process that's going to be playing out with Artemis 2 here, it looks like, at 8:07 p.m., I believe, Steve?
That's right.
So Godspeed to the crew, and what an exciting mission. We'll be getting into that, of course. But even beyond NASA and Artemis, we've seen space play a more and more central role across a huge range of different sectors, including different geopolitical hotspots and even conflicts, like we've seen with Ukraine and Iran, including the rescue of the downed airmen just in the last few weeks alone. So luckily, we've assembled an all-star, panel. I know. We're going to get through this together to help us unpack these topics and many more. So I'm not going to be able to do justice to any of their very impressive bios and backgrounds, but just to give you a few highlights of their accomplishments. First, we have Professor Timiyabi Aganaba, Assistant Professor, School of the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State. Very cool name for the school, by the way. And Timiyabi does so many cool things. So among other things, she's a senior global future scientist with the Global Futures Lab. She has been the executive director of the World Space Week Association. She's previously on the advisory board for the Space Generation Advisory Council, supporting the UN program on space applications, on the Science Advisory Board of Worldview Enterprises, on the Science Science Advisory Board of SETI, yes, that's SETI, a member of the UK-based Satellite Applications Catapult Advisory Group, and the first woman space lawyer in the history of the Nigerian Space Agency, which is pretty darn cool in and of itself. And among other things, lastly, Timiabi has represented Nigeria at the UN as a next-generation aviation professional at the International Civil Aviation Organization Model Council in Montreal and the legal subcommittee on the peaceful use of outer space in Vienna. And that's just a small taste of what she's accomplished already. So welcome, Timiabi. Next to her, you see Steve Miramina, who has had a long and storied career at NASA, but these days is teaching at Georgetown, at Yale, among other things. Steve has had more than 25 years of service as an international attorney at NASA's Office of General Counsel, where he helped negotiate over 1,000 international agreements supporting missions across all of NASA's directorates. As lead counsel for the Space Operations Mission Director, he advised on programs including the Space Shuttle, the International Space Station, the Astronaut Corps, and served as NASA's lead attorney for telecom and spectrum matters. And he knows the meatball guy who's responsible for the NASA trademark, and I believe the worm guy, right?
Worm guy.
As well, for that NASA emblem. So I mean, come on, this is great. That's going to be the next generation of The Office right there. Move over to Space Force. Moving to Space Force. So we have Mahesa Suprabhu. Did I get it? Close enough. I was thinking Superman. Cyber Test Project Officer, U.S. Space Force. He's commander of the 533rd Training Squadron, as well as doing quite a lot these days in training and sculpting the culture of cyber operations at Space Force. Basically, among other things, working on the cybersecurity curriculum that Space Force is now rolling out. He has more than 24 years of services in the Armed Forces, including 21 years in the Army Signal Corps, and now 3 years at Space Force. And he's a proud graduate of IU's Space Cybersecurity Digital Badge Program, if anybody's interested in that opportunity that we can talk more about. So welcome again to you all. As a kickoff question, kind of a twofold one to give you a chance all to weigh in and elaborate and correct anything that I might have gotten wrong. So first off, what got you interested in space to begin with? And second, in your view, what's the most pressing unresolved question in space governance today? So Timiabi, let's turn to you first.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. In my TED Talk, I start off saying, a British, Canadian, Nigerian outer space lawyer walks into a bar. No, that's not the beginning of a joke. That was me last night. And so I was born and raised in England and grew up in a small town in southern England. And when I was 24 years old, I decided to explore my roots and my heritage. And I went to law school in Nigeria in a village called Buari. And when you graduate from university in Nigeria, you have to do a year's service for the country. So I was posted as the part of the first legal team at the Nigerian Space Agency. So it was Legal Affairs and International Cooperation, so basically helping Nigeria develop its international partnerships, look at our liability issues, because we were going to be building this very expansive space program. And in that role, at that time, we were working with the Chinese. Nigeria was actually China's very first international client for space, and we were working with the British also. And so it was, I was young, it was a formative experience. And then when I left, I decided to go do a master's at the International Space University in France in space program management. And it was when I got there that I discovered I was some kind of unicorn, because no one had ever met anyone like me, or, wow, you're British, you're Canadian, you're Nigerian, you're a lawyer, you understand engineering. Like, that was when I became on the path to this field where I seem to be the only or the first or, all these things. So it's just been a fascinating career. This is my 20th year in the space industry, so I'm excited to talk more about all these governance issues. I am a lawyer by training, so I come at this from a legal and societal perspective.
Excellent. Any pressing unresolved governance question you wanted to flag at the beginning?
Oh,
we can return to that. Yeah.
There are so many pressing issues, so maybe I'll return to it.
We can return to it, indeed. Steve, please.
Well, thank you, Scott. Well, first, to the organizers, I want to say thank you. And with no shortage of space puns, I want to say I'm beyond the moon.
Oh, okay.
With gratitude
we'll accept it.
to be
we'll
here.
Accept it.
So thank you. I just retired from NASA a matter of weeks ago, but I had spent more than 26 years there, and I saw everything since 1999. I saw the birth and the launch of the space station, and I was working there when the first component was launched. I helped create a commercial space sector in terms of giving Elon Musk the seed money to create a commercial industry and then build a market in LEO. And,
Has he sent you a thank you note?
Well, it's funny that you should say that. At one point, he offered a Tesla to my secretary if he could get on the calendar. And I had to tell her she wasn't allowed to accept it.
It's more than $20,
rules in
I'd
the
say.
government
Yeah.
back then. So let's see. And since I've retired, I've just been increasing my teaching. I've been teaching for about 15 years at Georgetown and periodically at Yale and some other schools. I've written a book about space law, a number of articles. And in terms of how I came into space law, you had asked that. I knew when I had gone to college, I wanted to have an international career. Yeah. This was in the mid to late 80s that I was in school. So I studied a foreign language that would be useful for the foreign government, for the US government, and I studied Russian, because at the time that was our biggest competitor. And I thought maybe I would get a job working in the intelligence agencies. And then when I graduated college, I learned more about what some of the intelligence agencies do, and I thought, all right, I might want to do something else. And then I decided to go to law school and study international law, and then I later on got a master's degree in international law and specialized in aviation and space law, because what could be more international than outer space? And I'll talk about substantive issues when we go around.
Sure. That sounds great. Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah. Mahesa.
I'm also saying thank you for inviting me here today, and good afternoon to everyone. Mine's a little bit more simpler. I grew up watching Star Trek.
I was waiting, right? Come on.
The original series, I was curled up with my dad, but I was too young to understand it. It wasn't until like Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, that I really started getting into it. Kind of sealed it a little bit during undergrad in computer science. I took an elective in astronomy, and I was like, oh, this is some cool stuff. So a little bit later, while I was in the Army, I was getting ready to push my retirement packet, and they said, hey, we want some guys to come over from the Army to the Space Force, and I was like, sign me up.
You didn't say beam me up. No.
I didn't. I should have, though.
Thank you so much. Great introductions. And I did want to just welcome and acknowledge Tim Yabe's family in the second row as well. So thank you for being here. We're honored. So the first theme that I wanted to explore is around international law. So, first, please, Mahesa, feel free to weigh in, but primarily for you, Tim Yabe and Steve. The Outer Space Treaty turns 60 this coming year. For those who aren't aware, this is kind of the foundational Magna Carta, as it were, for multilateral space agreements. But it was written, of course, before GPS, commercial satellites, cyber operations, you name it. So kind of a broad question from both of your vantage points here, and please feel free to refer to other favorite international space treaties, because it's been a while since we've negotiated one, right? Since the 80s for a major multilateral agreement. So, is the Outer Space Treaty, because of all the pressures that we're seeing, still fit for purpose in this 21st century domain, or is it a somewhat now dated 20th century tool that's in dire need of an overhaul? What are your views on that?
Would you like to go first?
So we get this question a lot, right? A treaty that was negotiated, or people starting to think about it in the late 50s and solidifying from principles and resolutions to actual treaties. And what we have to remember, though, is that even though we only had 2 actors at the time that were actually able to exploit the outer space environment at that time, there were other countries that were part of the negotiations at the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. But even to today, now where we have 80 countries, over 80 countries, space agencies, commercial actors, et cetera, the Outer Space Treaty was always a principled framework. It was always something that doesn't have implementing arrangements to it, but has like a general baseline in which countries are supposed to collaborate with each other and have a minimum understanding. And so I think from that perspective, the Outer Space Treaty has worked. It has prevented weaponization of outer space. We have supposedly not had appropriation of outer space because of this framework that was negotiated then. And I would say that it still stands now. It's still robust now, but the issue is implementation of the provisions now that you have a multi-stakeholder environment and all these different actors. So I would just let Steve build on that.
Sure. Thank you. So I brought a copy of the Outer Space Treaty. If anybody wants to see it, we could pass it around.
I think we should.
I actually don't. I travel with these most of the time because when you're on an airplane and you tell people that you're a lawyer for NASA and you do space law, they say, "What is that? Is that really a thing? Like you get paid money to do that?" And I do, and I have,
Absolutely.
and I continue to get paid money to do that. So, but this is what it looks like. And as Tim Yebby had said, it says Treaty on Principles about the exploration and use of outer space. So the reason this works as a treaty, and for anybody in the audience who's thinking about studying law, is it's written so generally that it's true most of the time. And it didn't really come out that much over the last day or so, but in the practice of writing international agreements, the most successful international agreements are the ones where, of course, parties meet in the middle. And sometimes they have a lot of words but don't necessarily say anything, right? So there's nothing objectionable in it. So for example, Article 1 says the exploration and use of outer space shall be free for all countries. That's great. Everybody can agree with that, right? And Article 2 says outer space is not subject to national appropriation. So what that means is when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon and he planted the American flag, he did not say, "We are claiming the moon on behalf of America." He said, "We come on behalf of all humankind." Well, I think he said on mankind, but we would say all humankind nowadays. Article 3 says international law applies in outer space. And all the countries of the world can agree with that. But then it gets a little bit more ambiguous. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, I'm saying it's a good thing. Like Article 9 says, there shall be no harmful contamination of outer space. That's great, right? But then you hear stories about space debris and space junk, and you think, well, how can there be so much space junk if it says right here, there should be no harmful contamination?
That's right.
Well, if anybody's a lawyer in the crowd, you know if it says there shall be no harmful contamination, it means that some contamination is perfectly okay, right? That's what it means. If there's no harmful contamination, ordinary contamination is fine. And there's really no way to explore outer space without some contamination, right? And I don't know if you'd heard the story, like we were talking about toilets just this morning. And that's one of the big differences between the Artemis 2 mission that has a toilet on it and the Apollo mission, which had no toilet. So there are 96 bags of poop and feces that are on the moon right now. And they're from the Apollo mission, and that's absolutely true. And there are scientists who say we need to go back and get that stuff that's on the moon, because if you've got like human waste and it's bombarded by cosmic rays for the last 50 years, who knows what's growing up there? It's actually like fascinating from a biological standpoint to see if anything could survive all that. So
that's going to be our panel next time.
That's right. Yeah, you can call it space junk or something else.
Or something
else more appropriate.
Space, yeah.
So anyway, so the Outer Space Treaty, the reason I think it works, here it is 60 years later, is because it's written in terms that it was general, it was principled, as you noted, and we can figure it out later. And even though it was just the US and the USSR who were the primary actors, there's another article in there, Article 6, which says that states are responsible for the activities of their nationals. And we knew even at the time that we would have private industry in the United States representing us and working as our contractors. So we built that into the treaty. So currently it works. There hasn't been a situation so far that the treaty has not been able to govern.
And let me just press just for 1 minute on that last point, because I think it's good timing and relevant. Because during this mission in particular, there's been a lot of discussion about the lunar base that's being planned and potential industrial development and the use of resources on the moon, both for scientific exploration, but also for commercial opportunities. And that remains a hot topic of some discussion among space lawyers when we get to hang out with each other. So I'm kind of wondering if you could reflect briefly on that, then when we can return to the weaponization point and some other points that to me I'll be made in just a moment. But what are your thoughts about how well positioned this and other space treaties are at giving us a framework for beginning the regulation of those types of activities on the moon and beyond?
Okay, so the last treaty that was negotiated was what we call colloquially the Moon Agreement. This is a controversial treaty, apparently, because most of the major countries have not signed on to that treaty. There's about 17 signatories or so to that treaty, and that was the specific regime that was designed to regulate activities on celestial bodies. So the big argument, especially from the US perspective and commercial industry, was that this is bad for industry, particularly because that provision says that the celestial bodies are the Article 11, the common heritage of mankind. We should basically we should share resources in some kind of manner, even though it's not prescriptive in the agreement about how we do that. It lays these general ideas that space is the common heritage of mankind, all the resources up there, we have to think about it. But the US position and some of the major actors is that this stifles industry. We don't like this, we don't want to share resources. Developing countries are going to come along and say, give us something for nothing. For me, my reading of the Moon Agreement, and I should have brought my copy in case we argue, is that the provision that private actors keep being told, and the reason they keep saying it's bad for them, is because they're not really reading Article 11 correctly. Article 11.1 basically talks about the common heritage of mankind, but it says that it gets its understanding from the treaty itself. It doesn't get its understanding from other regimes like law of the sea, and so when people say we don't like common heritage of mankind, it's because they're looking at law of the sea. They're not looking at the Moon Agreement. And then Article 11.5 goes on to tell you basically the procedural steps that you need to take to be able to make Article 11.1 come into being, which is that there should be an international conference that discusses, all these things subject to paragraph 18. And then you go to paragraph 18 and it also gives you procedures. So when people say this doesn't work, it's not bad, I'm like, have you actually read the provisions? And have you seen that everything is based on people coming together and agreeing under this context, how do we want the moon to be governed? This ends up making me sound like I'm a champion for the Moon Agreement, which I'm not. I'm just, as a lawyer, I'm saying, okay, first of all, just make sure you've read Article 11, that you understand the nested way that provision works, and then we can have a conversation that it's so terrible and throw it out.
So thank you, because you've expressed a lot of my sentiment as well. So the Moon Agreement says that the international regime, which is a term found also in the Law of the Sea Convention, will be established when the commercialization of resources becomes feasible. So it's not yet feasible, but I would think so no spacefaring nations are party to the Moon Agreement, with maybe the exception of Australia. But
India is a signatory.
Oh, fair enough. Okay, good, thanks. But have they ratified? Okay. So setting that aside, in terms of commercialization and use of resources, and when the exploitation becomes feasible, I would think that the United States would want to be in on those conversations. If you're not a party to the Moon Agreement or the Law of the Sea Convention, you don't get a voice in how the implementation of that convention occurs, generally, because it's usually just the parties to the treaty who are involved. And given that, as you said, if you read it carefully, all it says is when we can commercialize outer space resources, we should create a regime. Well, maybe we should create that regime, because it's a lot easier to decide how we're going to divide those resources now before we extract them. Because once we extract them, and once any state has them in their possession, it's going to be a lot harder to say, I get some entitlement to those resources. And there are generally two resources on the moon that people are talking about. One is helium-3, which we could talk about, that it could have some value down here, and some rare earth elements. But the other one is just water. Lunar ice, which is water, is made up of, as you guys know, H2O, right? There's hydrogen and there's oxygen. So if you have water, that would mean the astronauts could have something to drink, and you all know how heavy it is to carry a gallon of water around. But if you have hydrogen and oxygen, you have the components of rocket fuel. So then you can go from the moon to Mars or to an asteroid. And if you have the water, then you have your fuel depot up in space. And then you have access to a lot deeper in the solar system than you would if you have to bring the fuel or the water with you every time you leave Earth.
Thanks.
Sure.
Let's bring you, Mace, into the conversation as well. So we've been talking about, these treaties and these different provisions and principles, and I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how much they're being operationalized and how much they're impacting the day-to-day work that you've been experiencing at Space Force. We've seen through Starlink and now Starshield, their really important role that a lot of companies, including SpaceX, are playing. Obviously private actors, Steve, as you were saying, under the direction of national governments. But I'm just kind of wondering, as you're listening in on this conversation, what reactions are you having about any governance gaps or otherwise?
Oh, first of all, I got a caveat.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my views are my own. They don't represent Space Force, Department of the Air Force, or any other government agency.
Absolutely.
But no, this is very important because cyber is pretty much inseparable from space right now. We only got a handful of people, like the International Space Station and the crew that we have on Artemis II, that are actually out there manning actual systems. But a lot of the stuff that we do in space is interconnected with the networks and the systems that are provided for that. And that also provides, with cyber, as you know, a lot of vulnerabilities. And so those vulnerabilities are very prevalent in all the systems, both terrestrial-based and space-based systems, especially older space-based systems. So the work that I do is securing those systems, or in my specific job right now is help training students so they know how to recognize those systems and protect those systems. So you got the ground. It's broken down into segments: the ground segment, the link segment, and the space segment. But the one that doesn't get talked a lot about, but is common talking in cyber, is the human factor, right? The weakest link is usually the human factor. And so I think we're doing a lot better getting after the awareness for what actually is involved with cyber and what are the vulnerabilities that are exposed. And I know one of the things the Space Force is doing right now is for all officers, they're training in space operations, which includes several mission areas, intel and cyber, which I think is a huge step towards understanding cyber as a whole so that future commanders can make those critical decisions. And I mean, even commanders now, they're getting a lot of education on cyber. And we're making a lot of steps in that direction.
And just on that topic briefly, we have a lot of technical debt floating around up there. So there was a lot of satellites, a lot of hardware put up before we really were focused on cybersecurity to the extent that we are today. Do you feel like we're now at least bending the curve for this new wave of satellites, including microsatellites, these mega constellations that are being proposed and launched, so that we're not contributing to the problem, that it's not going to get worse from a cybersecurity perspective? Do we have those, standards and supply chain agreements and et cetera in place?
Well, I think we're getting after it. It's a work in progress. I know, because I did test and evaluation, that we would put together groups of all the stakeholders to bring in aggressors and defenders from the cyber front. We'll bring in engineers and software developers and designers, and we'll bring in intel and operators to tell us, hey, this is what's important, this is what we're looking for. And so we would take all that information together, and like in a week or two, we'll develop a plan to kind of identify potential vulnerabilities so that we can seal those gaps.
No, thank you. And for the students, just two things. One, IU is a member of the international, basically it's called ISAC, so it's the Space ISAC, an International Sharing and Analysis Center for Cybersecurity. So we actually have the ability to send students to Colorado to participate in big space conferences. So if you're interested, come up to me afterward, we can get you guys connected. And then also here at IU, we have something called IU Create, which is led by Daniel Lovelace. It's a center for radiation-hardened microelectronics that does a lot of the cool work and testing, some of which Mahesa was just referring to. So just kind of a point of comment. Okay, before we leave international law, I could spend all day here. We could go into Latin, it'd be fantastic. But one other topic we really should hit is the Artemis Accords, right? Because even though we haven't seen major new international treaties for some time, it's not like agreements have stopped. As you alluded to, Steve, more than 1,000 of these have taken place. There's more than 60 signatories to the Artemis Accords now. Neither China nor Russia, right, have signed, of course. And I'm wondering if we could reflect, really all three of us, a little bit on some of the promise and some of the pitfalls, right, of this more minilateral, even bilateral, or as we would talk about here in Bloomington, polycentric, right, from the Ostrom Workshop tradition. the idea of building these like-minded communities rather than going after these major multilateral agreements. So maybe Timiyabi first, and then if you'd like to also, Timiyabi, talk about the role of the Global South as part of this, please feel free as well, because that's obviously a critical area here.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because to me, from the governance perspective, I think that is the area of priority right now, because technological fixes, I just don't think is the challenging part or the difficult part. I'm not an engineer, but I believe that if you put enough money and time and people towards a technical challenge, you'll find a solution. But the governance questions are very difficult. Who decides, right? Who's allowed at the table? How do we figure out the strategy, where we're going? So what the Artemis Accords has done that hasn't been done for a really, really long time is the US was able to propose the rules of the road that it wants to use for Artemis and everyone who wants to come on board with the US. 7 partners, I think, signed on first of all with the US, and now there's 60. So people say this is moving fast, this is the new governing regime. But if I'm the only non-American here, so I put my non-American hat on and say, 1, it's a political arrangement, it's not a treaty, right? Which means that political arrangements depend on the priorities of whoever is in power in that day, so it can go away tomorrow. And secondly, there are other countries who have other regimes too that they're developing similar to Artemis. So the Chinese and the Russians do also have a similar kind of arrangement, though that I believe is contractual rather than just a policy document. And people say that these two are opposed to each other because one is US-led, one is Russian-led. But using your words, we should be able to have a polycentric system. I mean, different actors can have different ways that they think about how they want to govern, but we do need interoperability somehow. The systems should be able to talk to each other. But right now, we're apparently having this kind of bifurcated system. And for me, I think if I have to add the Global South, so Nigeria and Rwanda were the first African countries to sign on. I was there at the signing. It was a White House event. And I was a little bit surprised at that time, to be honest, that we had signed that agreement without too much public consultation, without, I mean, I was there in the room and I was kind of blindsided, so I don't really appreciate what was the process that you took to decide you're going to join this. Right? And so sometimes we hear these big statements, oh, the US has 60 partners. Does that mean that everybody's on board? Does that mean that everybody's in the same direction just because you make a big announcement? So I'm not a fan of, this is the new governance regime, this is the way to go, because it depends on the implementing arrangements, right? What are the contracts that were signed? What are the benefits that different countries are going to get? And people should know what they're getting before they just sign on to something just to jump on a bandwagon. So those are just a couple of thoughts.
No. Thank you. Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear that you are not sold on the Artemis Accords. I was one of the people who wrote the Artemis Accords. So I'm just going to slide.
Finally, we get to the good stuff on the panel, please. Yeah.
I can look at your file. Everything you said is right. I don't disagree whatsoever. So what do the Accords say is really important, and why were they written, I think, is a corollary question. As we talked about, there have been no new treaties since 1979, 1980. And there will be no treaties, maybe even in our lifetime, maybe, because it's taking place in the United Nations. And there are a couple of reasons that the United Nations is not working in terms of new treaty making. One is anything that Russia or China proposes, the US is going to be against. The corollary, anything the US proposes, Russia and China is going to put the kibosh on. So there's no hope for a new treaty in that regard. Secondly, the treaty-making process in the UN is effectively broken because the COPUOS, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, operates on a consensus basis. So, and there are more than 100 countries who are in the COPUOS, and if one country wants to extract any leverage from the US or Russians or the Chinese, it's going to come up in these consensus decisions. And because it's consensus, oftentimes the substantive obligation gets watered down because it has to appeal to everybody. So given that there are no new treaties and no hope for new treaties, NASA and the State Department said, well, what can we do? We are going to go to the moon, and we are going to explore the moon, and there's going to be a traffic jam on the moon. I mean, in the next 10 years, NASA will be there, but so will the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, the UAE. Israel has sent a commercial company and a university sent a probe to the moon. Of course, the Russians and the Chinese are going to be there. And everybody is going to the South Pole of the moon because that's where the water is. So if we don't have some rules of the road, then we're going to have conflict. So in order to deconflict, NASA said we should come up with some procedures. And the Artemis Accords, like you said correctly, they're not legally binding, but they operationalize what's in the Outer Space Treaty. So Timi had referred to interoperability. We want things to work together on the moon. If we're going to create electricity on the moon, are we going to have 2 prongs or are we going to have 3 prongs, right? We don't want to not have the right adapter with us when we go there. And we want the Japanese rover to plug into the Australia. They're going to give some solar arrays, right? They're going to generate electricity. We want the rover to plug into the solar arrays so they work. The US is going to give spacesuits. The spacesuits have to plug into the rover, and the rover's going to have to plug into the solar arrays. So everything has to work. So one advantage that the US has at the moment is we're the first mover. And if we're going to go to the moon, then we're going to set the standards. And then people who come later are going to have to coordinate with us. And that puts us in a position of superiority, not dominance over other countries, but just technological superiority. And there is some risk that if we lose the, as people call it, the new space race with China, then China will be on the moon first or on Mars first, and then we will have to coordinate with them. And their industry will set the standards, not US industry. So it's very much a geopolitical, economic decision to make this investment. And when people say, well, why are we spending money on the moon when there are people who are hungry here on Earth and all, we have to have those longer discussions with them to explain the benefits that accrue to the country by the investments in the space program. Over.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah.
So I'm not a lawyer, so,
that's okay.
But just from reading it, I appreciated the Artemis Accords only because it looked like it expanded more on the Outer Space Treaty. Even though it may seem heavy on the US side, the challenge that I see is kind of some of the definitions and enforcement of some of the things in there. You talk about safety zones being temporary. And what is defining those safety zones exactly, and is it something that as a group agrees on? And then what is temporary? Like, is there a mission? Are there leases? Is it like, the thing that I think about usually from a computer perspective is like ICANN, right? Sure. Where everybody comes together, they agree on all these things, and they lease out like web addresses, something like that, to that effect. If there's something in store or planned that can probably do that. And then there's the other thing that once you occupy a space physically and your lease expires, what then? What if the person currently occupying it doesn't want to move and they don't want to pay their lease or whatever? What comes next? So and those are kind of the questions just kind of running around in my head.
Oh yeah. And cybersecurity is not explicitly called out, obviously, in Artemis, or for that matter, the security of shared critical infrastructure that might be on the moon to support things like water or you name it. So maybe there needs to be some. No,
I think interoperability is definitely important because, for people that don't want to play ball, if you cut them off because they're dependent on those connections. Yeah. Those are different ways of going about that.
Absolutely. And if I might elaborate on that just a little bit. So with the interoperability, we saw it just in the last year when Boeing brought the astronauts to the space station, and then the spacecraft wasn't functional sufficiently to bring the astronauts back down. And we
You're being very polite, Steve.
Let SpaceX bring them down. And they couldn't, because the suits which the astronauts were wearing, they plug into the Boeing spacecraft, but they didn't work in the SpaceX spacecraft. And there was just no way to do it. And I mean, personally, as a taxpayer, I think this is ridiculous. I mean, how can it be that SpaceX can't bring down an astronaut from the space station, right? It's only a 6-hour trip. They should be able to just hop in there. And anyway, and that's why the astronauts were up there for such an extended period of time beyond, they were up there for 10 months instead of 10 days.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's something very much now that it demonstrates interoperability and why we need to fix this for lunar exploration.
Oh,
But can I say, though, that takes us to the politics of standardization. So who sets the standards is still a who question at the end of the day. Oxford did a lot of research on how international standards bodies work. And it's still the power thing. It's still, if you're the first, and it's fine. America wants to be the first mover all the time, which is fine. But when you do set the standards and everybody has to follow your standards and your industry gets developed, et cetera, that's fine. That's fine. Every country can have that perspective, and the leading ones do. But I think the who question matters because space is not defined yet, the who, right? So it's still I say to African countries that, okay, so people say, you don't have electricity, you don't have water, why are you doing space? Space is still anyone's game in my estimation in terms of new space, in terms of the new things that we could do in space. And so if a country decided tomorrow to put in $1 billion into space, which I think an African country could do if they wanted to, then they could decide a whole bunch of new things. I remember when Rwanda got something like 300,000 licenses for 300,000 satellites at the International Telecommunications Union. And the press was all crazy, right? Because we talk about mega constellation and how terrible it is to do all these things. But when an African country does the same thing that others are doing, it seems so shocking. Like, why would Rwanda have that? And I mean, I'm like, why not? If Elon has 40,000 licenses for Starlink, why can't someone else? And so that who question keeps coming up in space, and we won't get away from it by just saying, you have the biggest technology, you have the rocket. The governance is more than just the technology.
So much to talk about, and I just have a few more, but I want to make sure we do have time for students as well. Okay, so we're going to be going for another, 7 or so minutes. So start thinking of the questions you would like to ask these amazing panelists. Let's pivot. I want to do more with security before we close, but let's pivot for a moment and talk about environmental factors here on Earth, as well as on the moon and beyond, right? So, Timiabi, for example, you've done so much amazing work in Texas and more broadly around the community and the environmental impacts of space operations, particularly SpaceX. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that for a moment. And then I'd love to hear from Steve about some of your recent work looking at, long-term environmental impacts on the moon, including cultural sites that maybe should be protected as we return. So maybe Timiabi, to you first.
Yeah, my current work is very interesting. So Texas in Boca Chica is where you have Starbase. So that's basically SpaceX's launch site. And when SpaceX first got the license, or when they started thinking about using that site a long time ago, you have to do these environmental impact assessments and, what are the effects, et cetera, of what you're trying to do. So at that time, they didn't have plans for the heavy launcher, right? So they got a license for, less activities. Anyway, come to today, SpaceX have now incorporated Boca Chica. So Boca Chica now is a SpaceX town. And, they're trying to get a police service and fire service. And the launch site is right on a road, like a public road, right in front of the beach. It's really, but when you go there, it's astounding. The infrastructure, everything that they've done, taken over that whole place, it's amazing. But what's really fascinating in that area that I study is indigenous opposition. So the indigenous tribes have taken space, they've been fighting SpaceX for the last 5 years. And last month I was in Texas for the Supreme Court hearing because they've been squashing this case all along. And it finally got to the Supreme Court to argue whether the indigenous people can actually make their claims. So all these arguments so far have just been about legal standing, which means the right to even speak, which I think is really frustrating, because why should they not get a right to speak? This is their territory, they have sacred relationships to the land, etc. And because SpaceX and space is like this national priority, geopolitics, everyone along the way can just get steamrolled. And I'm so proud of this indigenous group for being strong enough to fight this and to see where we go with this, especially because in Texas, the right to the beach is a constitutional right. And that means that they are breaching the Constitution by not allowing people to actually use this. So it's not just a Boca Chica case. This is everyone in Texas and everyone generally that should be looking at the impacts of space activity and what that means for people going forward so that we say, is it space at all costs? Or do we still look at the impacts and externalities of the things that we do?
Thank you so much, Tamiabi. And would you like to talk about some of your recent work on the moon?
Sure, sure. I've just done a little bit of research, and now that I don't work for Uncle Sam anymore, I feel I have a First Amendment again. And
That's right.
I can start writing about things that are disturbing to me. But I want to interrupt myself to compliment you on your socks. I see Ruth Bader Ginsburg looking at me.
Oh, indeed.
And
I was going to do Star Trek, but then I pivoted, so yeah.
in a similar vein, I wore my Snoopy astronaut tie. So I figured it'd be timely for today.
It's got to be done.
Exactly.
It's got to be done.
Very much related to what Tamiabi has been saying about indigenous concerns. There was a recent dust-up, if you will, in January of 2024, where there was a mission launched to the moon that was not reviewed by the federal government. So there was a commercial company, it was called Astrobotic, and they launched a mission called Peregrine to the moon. And it's a longish story, and I won't tell the whole story, but the nutshell or the takeaway is that on the mission, this company called Astrobotic had a lot of extra space that NASA didn't need to use. We put some payloads on it and said, hey, deliver this to the lunar South Pole for us. And they said, sure, but they had this extra space on the rocket. So they put out a note to the public on their website, and they say, hey, anybody, if you guys have any stuff you want to send to the moon, just give it to us, and we'll bring it. This is true. They had these, they called them DHL moon boxes, and for a couple of $100, depending on what size box you wanted, you could launch anything you wanted to the moon. If you had some, like, old, I don't know, cufflinks or a love letter from an ex, or maybe most offensive, if you had some cremated remains, if you have, like, you know, your beloved grandfather who always loved looking at the night sky and you wanted to finally put him on the moon, or if you had your dog cremated and you want to put your dog's ashes on the moon, you could give them to this company and they would be launched to the lunar surface. Now, this is all true. The Navajo heard about this and they said, well, wait a second, we revere the moon. Our ancestors, when they die, their spirits go to the moon, and we object to that. And hey, NASA, why are you doing that? And you have to also go back about 20 years ago, where NASA actually had launched, Gene Roddenberry's ashes to the moon, and he was the author of Star Trek, right? And at that point, the Navajo said, hey, we object to cremated remains being launched to the moon. And NASA said, oh, don't worry, if we ever do it again, we promise we'll consult with you. Well, fast forward to 2024, and there was no consultation that took place. And in fact, NASA said, oh, we don't need to consult with you, because that's not our launch. It's a commercial company's launch. Anyway, because you may not know this, I'll just share. In US law, certain US agencies have US functions, right? So the FAA, they license launches. FCC, they license telecommunications. There's no US agency with the authority to regulate what happens in outer space. So there's no US agency, and there's no money. I mean, Capitol Hill, an agency can only do that which it has an appropriation for. Congress has not given the authority or the money to any agency at all. That means, so under the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6, it says the U.S. shall authorize and continually supervise the activities of its nationals. The U.S. is breaching the treaty because we're not continually supervising the activities of our nationals because no one has the authority to do it. So once a rocket is launched, there's no law that applies. And it's just shocking to me that the U.S. would have this gap in the law. And I think it's a problem because A, there's a potential breach of the treaty. B, respect for indigenous rights is really just thrown out the window. We don't respect indigenous rights here in the US, but also other countries around the world have similar indigenous concerns like the Maori, or other, we started to get into a discussion a couple nights ago where we were talking about standing, just like you said. And we were wondering, I wonder if there's a way we could give the moon some kind of a legal personality, where if something's happening on the lunar surface, there should be somebody who's a steward for the moon to say, hey, I object to that. And I imagine most people in the audience have read the Lorax, right? Where the Lorax says, I speak for the trees. Well, there's nobody to speak for outer space. And I think that's an issue. And I think that in terms of governance and forward problems, I think that is something that we're going to need to resolve moving forward.
Remembering a scholar who came through the Ostrom workshop not long ago to talk about standing for river systems in New Zealand and otherwise, so it's a similar idea. It's fascinating. Mahesa, just briefly before we open it up to questions from students and otherwise, a lot of folks in the room have seen WALL-E. They've seen Gravity. And from you, kind of tragedy of the space commons perspective, right? Perhaps you could just weigh in just for a moment and help us think through, is Space Force, doing different types of exercises or risk modeling around that type of cascading incident and the damage, frankly, that, for example, coordinated cyber attacks across different types of infrastructure could do, short, medium, long term, that would make a lot of what we're talking about much more challenging. So how is Space Force preparing for some of those eventualities?
Well,
to the extent you can talk about any of it.
So part of it is just messaging. Like you're talking about, nobody controlling what goes in the box and nobody's looking it up. To me, it's like we need some kind of TSA for, and that's not the Space Force, but we need some kind of TSA for space, making sure, something dangerous isn't going up. Sure. Because anything that goes up and, things moving around the globe at really fast paces is a challenge and can be a weapon. So even whether you use a DAA-SAT, anti-satellite missile, which is very expensive and probably the least likely to be used, or a cyber attack, if you render things in orbit unusable, it could essentially become a weapon itself. So I think that's important just to realize that we have be responsible, right, with what's in space. Nobody wants a space war because it's going to affect everybody. We all rely on space technology for our regular daily lives. Everything from airplanes to ships to ATMs to IC units. So if anything goes on in space and it escalates, it's going to be a huge problem. So just having a responsible mindset and how that stuff is managed is extremely important, and that's something that we're definitely cognizant of.
Oh, no doubt.
Can I just say, in the first panel on agriculture, the director of agriculture was saying about how they're moving towards land stewardship as a concept, and rather than sustainability, because sustainability means also sustaining the practices that you have. They're bad. And we also have this in space because we focus on space sustainability. That's like our new kind of concept. But this idea of stewardship means that you are supposed to be responsible because we're supposed to be taking care of the place. But with this idea of space being a war-fighting domain, which is basically this administration's, or the Trump administration's, I guess their most robust thing that they came up with, the Space Force, I think that if we take a more environmental perspective rather than a domain perspective, it might help us have a bit more of these feelings of care about where we go. So not just to do whatever we like because we can, but actually because we want to sustain this for future generations, which is why I think the indigenous perspective really matters. Now, from the environmental law perspective, even though Article 9 is the closest that we have to environmental principles in space, I think Article 3, saying that international law applies in space, gives us the opportunity to think of, well, what systems do we have that we can adapt into thinking about the space environment? When I was in Nigeria 20 years ago at the Space Agency, my research was on the application of environmental law to the space debris issue. And 20 years ago, that must have sounded absolutely crazy. Space is not an environment. The NEPA Act, the National Environmental Protection Act in the US, talks about human environments. But I think today space is becoming a human environment. If we want to live and work permanently in space, then we should have this environmental stewardship sustainability perspective. And that's why I think listening to non-traditional actors matters, because they're not trying to beat China or beat the US. They're saying, what is in it for us? How do we continue getting benefits from it? And so I think that's the societal approach that we need to take moving forward.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
So if I might just add one sentence on that, and that is what Timmy Abbey is talking about is what I've heard expressed as intergenerational equity. That is, we have an obligation to future generations to maintain environments for them. And it's weird because, as when I put my lawyer hat on, people who are not born, they have no legal rights. They can't stop us from doing something that we want to do. So I need to put a different hat on. It could be academic hat, it could be an ethical hat, or just the feeling of what's right and what's wrong. And to the students in the crowd, there's a huge difference that you need to know in your whole careers between that which is legal and illegal versus that which is right and that which is wrong. And if you're ever lawyers, your clients are going to say, hey, is this legal or not? You'll have to tell them. But I think you also owe them an obligation to say, it might be legal, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do.
Well, speaking of the next generation, which I think works for the students and for a solid Star Trek reference, let's hear from you. So what questions do you have for the panel, please? And if you wouldn't mind saying your name and major as well, that'd be great. Yeah, I see this and then we can go back. Yep.
My name is Mia McClellan. I study cybersecurity and global policy. So with that, I recently learned about the AU and things like that, and how land across cultures isn't defined in the same way. So in some areas it can be privatized, in other areas it's communal. So my question is, when talking about the who owns space, who operates in space, is it absolutely necessary to have a who in the first place? Can we have it be a communal space that isn't belonging to just one entity? And what does that look like when some countries have significantly more resources and advancement in that area?
By AU, you mean African Union? Okay. So states don't want to get rid of their power, right? It's very hard for them to want to give their authority away. And even though we have the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, the Office of Outer Space Affairs, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty basically solidifies that the state, is going to have power over its nationals. And Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty says that the state of registry should retain jurisdiction and operational control of its space vehicles or its space objects. So the state will always find a way to still keep a connection, right? Either it's its nationals or it launched, right? So the launching state is going to be able to still be able to retain that kind of power. For them to decide that they're actually going to give away power to someone else somehow to regulate is really, really difficult. And I was part of the Paris Agreement climate negotiations, and that was really fascinating to see something go from 0 to 180 states very quickly. And that happened, I believe, because the US and China signed the agreement first. So after the US and China signed the Paris Agreement, then everybody just followed. And unfortunately in space, I think that everything will go if those actors agree on something, because everyone else will just follow. But would they agree to give up any power, have a communal place? I'm not sure at this point.
Well, I want to say something on that. So I think kind of what we were talking about the other day was with all these different countries with that shared space, the challenge is trust. We didn't bring it up, but trust is important. And, feeling like a bad divorce because we used to work together in space, but not so much anymore. How do we do reconciliation? What are some, from a technical point of view, because it's, that's kind of from my background, how do we, you're familiar with zero trust in cybersecurity and building infrastructure where you don't necessarily have to trust the people that you're working with, but you can start to trust the system that's built, something like distributed ledger. But of course, there'd have to be stuff to reinforce or enforce some of that stuff.
Yeah, it reminds me of Lynn Osham's famous quote that trust is the most important resource, and it's certainly a scarce resource, as we've heard the last few days, but never been more important. I think the next hand I saw was back there, I believe, and yes, please. So, yeah, there we go.
To the whole panel, the question is also a matter of translation. How do we, as students and academics, take our work, even on abstract legal concepts, and start to understand the implications that it's going to have for these systems, both operationally, but again, with that view towards the future of how far out any realization of these concepts might be?
So as international lawyers or as lawyers, we get caught up on this idea of binding versus non-binding, right? Is this a legal document? Is this a soft law? And I think we have to get away from that now, because it's not really the bindingness of an agreement that means that people are going to respect and adhere to it. In my research, I work on a concept, accountability density, and it's basically, okay, what are the minimum procedural, concepts that you need for something to be accountable, whether it's legal or not? So do you have mechanisms for review? Do you have mechanisms in which people can have contestation? Do you have a capacity building mechanism to your regime? Are your rules embedded in like licensing and in contracts and things like that? So as we start to think more about what does it mean to be accountable, what does it mean to be legitimate, rather than we have no law so we can do whatever we want, I think that's the way we need to move forward. And if we look at other regimes, accountability doesn't always work. So review, under the Paris Agreement, Article 13 is the transparency mechanism. So states have to report their greenhouse gas emissions and what they're doing. Does that change what's happening with climate change because they report? Probably not, right? But is it better than nothing that you at least have to come and report so that we know what you're doing? Yes. And what space needs is not necessarily more laws and more rules for us to actually do anything, but accountability mechanisms.
Thank you.
No, I agree.
Just like to add? Yeah. Okay, excellent. I believe, yes. We'll have time for a few more at least. There we go. Then we can go back and back.
First of all, it's an amazing session, like any other session during this conference. My name is Natalia Shuga, and I assume I'm only Ukrainian, this audience. So when I start, I introduced for the first time at the Diplomatic Academy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, course titled Science Diplomacy. So the treaty you just cited, and also Antarctic Treaty, were two successful international treaties wherein science was involved heavily, and scientists, also it was the Cold War, could advise lawyers and statesmen to come up with these important documents which are still working today. So my question to all of you is, for what extent you use that tool, this instrument of science diplomacy, which was coined by Juan Tarakian, who was that time at State Department, and now we have the whole science diplomatic hub at Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C., talking about different aspects when science diplomacy can help to build this bridge when lawyers cannot do that job. Presidents could not do this job. But when you involve the scientist, it might kind of ease up the process to make adjustment on me, even to write a new treaty. Because it's what we're talking about. We have global challenges, how we can use UN at a certain point, or any international organization backed by United States, at least for now, to emphasize this importance and to bring scientists to the picture more and more. Thank you.
So I'll take the first bite at that one. So I agree with you that science can bridge the gaps that politicians are not able to. We have so many global issues that are global in nature and need a global approach. Let's take climate change for one. No one country can handle that on their own. Yet in the US, there's a law that forbids NASA from working with Chinese scientists. It says there should be no bilateral cooperation between the US and China. It's called the Wolf Amendment. It's been in place since 2011. If you have a scientific approach, this law makes no sense. How can the US not cooperate with China on an issue such as climate change? I mean, China is such a large landmass. We need to know, what is the ozone like there? What is the stratosphere like? What are measurements like on the ground? We need to know what they're seeing in their water. You saw The Martian, the movie, right? where China was the only country that was able to help the US in saving Mark Watney. The Chinese are active. They have a space station right now. They have astronauts. They have an astronaut corps. They're the only country right now that can launch astronauts to its own space station. Yet the US is not allowed to collaborate with them. They've done things on the far side of the moon that NASA never has. They've placed rovers there. They've planted seeds there. How can it be that our American scientists, it's against the law for them to speak to their Chinese counterparts, for them to say, share the data with us, tell us about what you learned on the far side of the moon. And it doesn't make sense from a scientific perspective. So there has to be a way where, like you said, get the lawyers out of the way, get the politicians out of the way, and collaborate on a scientific basis. And like you said, it worked really well in Antarctica, and it works in other regimes where we can take the politics out of the equation.
And brought up Ukraine as well, and I know we're pretty much out of time here, but really briefly, Mahe, so that's sometimes referred to as the first space cyber war because of the attacks on Viasat in the opening days of that war, and I'm just wondering, if you wanted to reflect just briefly, is this a hallmark of international armed conflict going forward, or are all wars going to be space cyber wars in effect, do you think?
No, I think so, definitely. Like, that set a precedent that's going to continue. Space and cyber being first movers in anything, because what's the important thing if you're going to move on something? You've got to take out communications. You've got to take out C2. So, and it's relatively inexpensive. And one of the biggest challenges is attribution, and we have to probably have to get after a way for some of you smart people in the audience. How do we solve attribution? If we've got various technologies out there that can profile you, you've got your phones and Alexa and whatever that know everything you want, know, and need before you do, and even know your thoughts sometimes. Like there's stuff out there that if you probably put together, you could probably figure it out. And so trying to get after a systemic way to get after attribution, to again hold people accountable.
Absolutely.
Can we get all the questions?
Oh yeah, please.
No, I'm saying, can we get all the questions?
Oh yeah, you said one more question? Yeah. I think we had time for one more last one, as long as, it's up to Heather really, let's be honest. So please. We can go all day. Yeah.
I'm glad you allowed one more. Thank you. I'm Keaton. I'm the Assistant Director of Outreach Initiatives here at Hamilton Luger. But you brought up so many different things that I would have never considered, and I'm sure this is true for many members of the audience. Is there anything that stands out as the most bizarre, obscure, like how is this my job issue or consideration that came across your desk that had real world, like intense repercussions?
I'll go first.
I'm sure you got a couple, Steve.
So I'm going to go with bizarre and real-world repercussions. And I can tell you many funny stories. In fact, if you all want to have like a beer or something after, I'll. And just to give you an example, and this is not my answer to you, but NASA gets a lot of FOIA requests. Now, you guys know FOIA? It's a 4-letter word, Freedom of Information Act, and that's how we felt about it when it would come into the office. And there are people, I don't remember the technical word, maybe whack jobs. There are a lot of people in prison who have nothing to do, and they write letters to NASA. And those letters come to NASA attorneys. And there are people who say, hey, please, I'm making a FOIA request for my astronaut records when I was an astronaut in your agency, in certain years. And by law, we have to respond to these requests. So we'll do a search of our records, and these people were never astronauts. I mean, they're locked up. I mean, you can look at the return address, and it's like some penitentiary in Oklahoma. And we have to write them a really nice note that says, "Dear so-and-so, thank you for your interest in the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. We've done a thorough review of our records, and we can't find any records responsive to your request. Thank you for your interest in the space agency." And that happens a lot. So there are people who just do FOIA requests. So that's going to be the bizarre. But the real world implications, I want to take a quick minute and tell you the most interesting thing I worked on while I was a NASA lawyer. And that was, many of you will remember, maybe around 2010 or so, I don't remember exactly, but there were some miners in Chile, and they were underground, and the mine collapsed, and there were 33 miners trapped underground. And it was scary. It was a story that was heard all around the world, like, how can we save these miners? And the government of Chile reached out to the government of the United States to say, is there a way that you could help? And the White House called NASA to say, NASA, is there anything you can do to help these miners? And NASA actually had a lot of relevant experience because we deal with people who are in remote places, who are very cold, who are very far away, who potentially might be very lonely, and we ensure their survival. So I was the lawyer who worked on giving technical advice from NASA to the Chileans on how to save these Chilean miners. And mind you, it's pitch black down there 24/7. So we had a lot of good advice, like they needed to be put on a 24-hour schedule of light and dark and sleep, and they needed to be entertained and have videos drop down to them and things just to have some normalization of life and such. And we, lots of information about diet and protein and all that. Well, as you may know, all 33 miners were rescued, and we were very involved in helping them get to the surface, and they had to be careful of depressurization, like if you're a deep sea diver and you get the bends if you come up too fast. Anyway, so we worked all that up from an engineering perspective. But the funny part of the story, and not everybody knows this part, is so the 33 miners all survived, they all came to the surface, and 32 of them were very happy to come up to the surface.
Oh no.
And there was the 33rd guy who came to the surface where both of his wives and families were waiting for him. Exactly. And the wives and the families, they got to know each other. And they would come every day.
Was that in the movie? I don't know.
And,
is it? Okay.
I think that guy still wishes. He was
yeah, right? Put me back in.
So that's my answer to your question.
Amazing. Yeah. Any other reflections from
Well,
the review? Yeah.
No, I do have some. It's really cool, actually, because, talk about the Artemis II going up and going around, and Brigadier General Haig, he's one of the Space Force astronauts, was on TV talking about all the different organizations in the Space Force that's like monitoring and tracking and helping these organizations go through. And one of those, he was talking about space domain awareness and how that specific organization is tracking. I was actually part of the test and evaluation of the software that does that tracking system. So that was pretty cool, especially to hear that.
That's super cool, Mahisa. Well done.
Yeah, I think what these examples make me think of is my favorite quote by Ed Finn and Joey Esrich, which says, "Space is not a void, but a canvas for the human imagination. Questions of policy and logistics are merely scaffolding for a deeper set of questions about who we are and who we want to become. We explore the universe not just because we are curious, but because of what that curiosity will do to us and how we will grow to match our expanding sphere of influence and understanding." And I love that quote because, and the reason I know it off by heart is that when I first saw it, I was like, wow, that says it all. But over my 7 years that I've been in America and I've started taking a more critical perspective, I say, well, is space really a canvas? It's not blank. It's not a blank canvas. There's a lot of history. So I see space more as a mirror. It's really a mirror reflecting who we are, and sometimes we get to see the ugly side of ourselves when we look at that. So one of the cases that I think kind of hit me, apart from this work with Indigenous people, that's really changed my view of whether I think space is as cool as I thought, is, you know, another actor, you know, put these tardigrades, I don't know if you know these little water bears, tardigrades, they're some of the most resilient bugs we have on Earth. And an American private actor, they put